Olabisi from the Department of Community Sustainability and Environmental Sciences and Policy Program at Michigan State University. She's an ecologist and participatory modeler. She works directly with communities to create change in complex systems and was recently a visiting scientist at the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. Her published research includes over 50 articles and a co-edited book on participatory modeling, focusing on food systems and climate resilient agricultural practices. She holds a Bachelor of Science from Brown University and a doctorate from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Laura, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'm thinking it's done, right? This one's working?
Yeah,
okay.
You can, no, actually you'll use the microphone.
I should use this.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Thank you, John. And as John said, obviously, these are going to be whirlwind talks. The introduction to climate change and its impacts on Africa in 10 minutes. This could be an entire day of discussion, but hopefully it will give you good food for thought. And I apologize in advance. I won't be able to make the breakouts later. I have to leave at 1 to take my son to an appointment. But feel free to contact me with any questions or follow up afterwards. I'm happy to talk with any of you about any of these topics. If you Google my name, I'm pretty much the only Laura Schmitt Olabisi on the internet, so I will pop up, and I'm at MSU. So. Okay, so I think my overall framing that I want to give you here is that climate change, so just as we heard Professor Ntalaja walk us through how the global north was enriched by colonialism and the exploitation of African peoples and the extraction of African resources, the global north has also been enriched by the burning of fossil fuels that are having a disproportionate impact on the global south, including Africa, including small island nations, when Africa did not contribute to this problem. So this is a chart that kind of shows you the breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions by region. Clearly, you can see Africa way at the bottom in terms of how many greenhouse gas emissions they have contributed to global warming. But these graphs even understate the issue, right? Because the main greenhouse gas that contributes to global warming is carbon dioxide, and that has a residence time in the atmosphere of about 200 years. So from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, all of that CO2 is mostly still up in the atmosphere, creating warming, and almost all of that was emitted by currently wealthy countries like the United States, the European Union, Australia, Japan, Canada, et cetera. And so this even more grossly understates how little Africa has contributed to the problem in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and yet is going to, and is currently suffering a lot of the consequences. And so this is, I should mention that all of these graphics, most of them at least, come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, which you can go online and download for free. I was a contributing author to that report. This is from the chapter on Africa. And so you can see that global warming is expected to have very high impacts, very high to high impacts on biodiversity loss, ecosystem disruption, mortality and morbidity of humans from heat and infectious disease, and reduced food production from crops, fisheries, and livestock on the continent. And I should mention that we are currently on track globally with current global commitments to hit 3 degrees C, which is far of warming over baseline, which is far above what scientists are recommending to keep us in a safe operating space for global ecosystems and economy, which is ideally under 1.5 C, but it looks like we've already potentially overshot that. So 2 degrees C is really what we need to commit to, but currently we're not there yet. One of the major impacts, potential impacts on African agriculture, of course, is a decline in projected yield for major crops in Africa. So you can look across here and see that for maize, rice, and wheat, for different regions of Africa, under 3 degrees C of warming, which is again what we're currently headed to, you have dramatic changes in yield for all of those staple crops. Now there is a somewhat good news, which is that some traditional crops like root and tuber crops and small grains like millet and sorghum, for example, are more resilient to some of the climatic changes that we're seeing. However, the reason why maize, rice, and wheat were widely adopted is because they're high yielding, right? So you have a little bit of a trade-off in climate resilience versus yield for some agricultural systems on the continent. Another thing to keep in mind is projected sea level change and its potential impact on coastal communities. So these are three different graphs here of Dar es Salaam in the upper graphic, Lagos, Nigeria in the lower left, and Cairo and Alexandria in the lower right, showing potential inundation of these major cities with tens of millions of people living in them under different scenarios of sea level rise. Sea level rise under climate change happens for a couple of reasons. The major one right now is because as water gets warmer, it expands and starts to move up the coast. I just spent a year in Nigeria. I was in Lagos a lot. It's a very low-lying city. It's very marshy. And a lot of the communities that are living in those high inundation risk areas are poor people, basically. Some of the wealthier folks can afford to kind of build up embankments or move up onto the highlands, but it's likely the poor that are going to be the most affected by the sea level rise. And then disturbingly, you can look at projected declines in GDP for African nations under these different scenarios of warming. So on the top is kind of the worst case scenario of 4 degrees C. But even under more moderate warming, even if we stay under the 1.5 degrees C cap or the 2 degrees C cap, you're still going to see negative changes in GDP for virtually every African nation. So from the graphs I showed you, projected impacts are pretty severe in agricultural production, in living and inundation in coastal cities, and in economic impacts on the continent. Okay, so what do we do about this? So in climate change work, we talk about two different things. We talk about mitigation, which is any action taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to try to stop global warming, to keep it below that 2 degrees C cap, ideally. And that is a task that is predominantly for wealthy nations that are burning fossil fuels to do, because there is no pathway to climate mitigation without switching off of fossil fuels and decarbonizing our economies. So that's mainly for those of us in the US and other wealthy nations. The second is adaptation, which refers to how to change or adapt a lot of systems like agricultural systems, like economic systems, in order to deal with or moderate the potential damages associated with climate change. And that is something that has to happen on a massive scale in African nations, as well as the mitigation. Not either or, but both. Because as I showed you, even if we keep warming under 2 degrees C, there are still going to be major impacts on African countries. Okay, well, the problem is that funding for research on how to do adaptation in Africa and alternatives to how to adapt current systems is extremely low compared to the amount of research that's being conducted in the rest of the world. So you can see on the left here, the funding for climate research in Africa is, minuscule compared to what is going on in the rest of the world. So that's an issue. Climate finance is a little bit more nuanced picture. There have been a lot of commitments to finance climate adaptation in Africa. Commitments being the key word, not, a commitment does not necessarily mean translate to funding on the ground. And then obviously, given the current situation politically in the United States, a lot of that money has kind of been clawed back and is no longer available. However, I will say this is a key ongoing conversation, and it's kind of recognized in the climate space that the private sector critically has to get involved in this too. That there simply is not enough funding committed, kind of bilaterally or from multilateral sources or from, the nonprofit sector, that there really has to be the private sector brought in to help finance climate adaptation in Africa as well. So that's a really critical ongoing conversation at the United Nations climate meetings. Okay, so this is kind of a whirlwind tour through climate impacts in Africa. So what can we do, right? Because I know that part of what you're talking about this afternoon is concrete actions, right? So in conclusion, Africa is facing enormous potential impacts from a global problem that they did not contribute to, and the resources and information to support African adaptation are woefully inadequate. So in the global north, the main things we should do are to push our communities and our governments to mitigate climate change, right? To get that political will going, and also to advocate for adaptation in African countries. In the United States, because we're a highly individualistic country, a lot of times when you talk about climate adaptation or climate mitigation, it's talked about at the very personal level, like, oh, you should go vegan, you should change your light bulbs. Those things are great. If you can do that, do it. But I should point out that there are many other spheres of influence that you are part of, right? You can get together with other people in your communities and advocate for climate action. When I first came back from Nigeria, the East Lansing City Council elections were going on. I was shocked to see that not a single council member had climate action as part of their platform. You guys can influence that if you live in East Lansing, okay? So think about things beyond the personal and the private that you can also do. All right, that's it.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Sorry that you won't be able to, I understand, part of our discussion this afternoon. We are keeping on time. Our second area is going to be education. This is an area that's dear to my heart because I'm an educator that's been involved with education in Africa for over 50 years, but I'm not going to present. We're going to have a wonderful Ghanaian scholar to and present. Let me introduce Priscilla Davies. Ms. Davies is a Ghanaian educator, scholar, and researcher, and doctoral candidate in counseling, education, and supervision at Michigan State University. Her work broadly focuses on promoting psychosocial well-being among individuals with disabilities and other marginalized populations, with particular attention to how social and structural conditions shape access to education and opportunity. Having completed her early education in Ghana, her academic research and experiences across two continents inform her interest in ways broader social challenges, including conflict, can influence educational pathways and well-being. I should say that she is a doctoral candidate. As I said, she's actually going to be defending within the next month, and she has a job already, which is wonderful. And so, welcome, Priscilla, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, John. It's kind. Okay, so trying to keep to my 10 minutes, but I'm going to start with a question. So when a school is burnt down in the Eastern Congo, or a teacher flees Darfur, or when a generation of South Sudanese kids grew up without an education, who benefits? That's where I started to think about this whole thing. Again, thinking about our topic, which is imperialism and how it affects education, and some of the historical and contemporary manifestations of this on education specifically. So I would give a quick example of Congo, and we have the expert here, so he would give us a better one, but I'll do my best right now. So let me rather start with the historical antecedents. So education as we have in Africa was, as built by the colonizers, really built something that wasn't meant to emancipate the African or to liberate the African. It was really meant to administer Africans. So typically they had clerks, they had translators, they had very docile and softened educators who basically helped the colonizers administer Africa and manage it and extract the resources that we had. So in the 50s and 60s, when we started to have African countries becoming more, getting their independence, they got this system of education that really wasn't meant for the African. That was just meant, it had too much external influence. The curriculum wasn't meant to educate the African to be an emancipated person. It was something that was meant to keep the African maintained and still subservient to the historical masters that we had. So what happens is that once you have this kind of education, it makes it very fragile. it makes it very easy to target. Then comes conflict. So when conflict comes, what happens? Militia would always target the schools, recruit these kids from the classrooms into illegal militia. What they will do is that sometimes they even host the militia in the classroom, so the kids are displaced, the teachers are running away, and then you are left with some children who will never get an education, or would get an education that is not really meant to give them the emancipation that their minds need. So then my argument is that who benefits? Because if you're having an Africa that has kids who are never going to get an education and so are illiterate, that will mean that, for example, using Congo, all that resource, all that minerals that is basically feeding electric cars and our phones are going to be extracted out of the Congo without the people even benefiting. The people don't even know the amount of money that is being extracted out of their nation. So one, keeping Africa and these kids and generations of Africans uneducated means that it will be a cycle that always goes on because people are not educated enough to even negotiate. My own country, Ghana, is an example. We have resources that are being extracted and our politicians are not that open-minded to negotiate terms that will benefit the country. So for every dollar that is gotten out of the resources in Ghana, 68 cents is leaving the country. The 30 whatever cents that are meant to stay in the country is still used to pay expats. So there's so much that the uneducated African is losing simply because we don't have the understanding to know that some of these things that we have, we are better able to manage it if we don't involve these imperial powers that are still, now they have left physically. I mean, we all have our independence, but still, that imperial influence is still in the country and is really in our continent, actually, and it's not really helping our people, and it's not helping the globe, I mean, the whole world, as it were. Again, one thing that I have to raise, which probably will be a repetition, is that most of the resources that we have, even the revenues that we have, are managed by people in the global north. The ATM cards that we have, I was privy to some of these discussions on another level, and I find that even the systems to manage it are here in the global north, and we still have to pay millions and millions for these technological systems that we use in Africa for our ATM cards. So then again, just not to bore you, let me just close with just two thoughts that what is at stake with having these imperial influences on education in Ghana is, I mean, in the world, is more of sovereignty. Because in that case, Africans are not able to maintain a very sovereign state. We still have that imperial influence on our nations. Again, having the imperial impact on our education also means that our histories are being wiped away. Identities are being wiped away because the education that we have is something external, not really based on the fact that we as Africans are designing education to educate ourselves. So there are kids who are growing up who can't even speak the local languages where they come from. So such a kid, if you say you're Ghanaian and you can't even speak any Ghanaian language, how does such a kid build up their identity around the Ghanaian influence or around the African influence? So once again, it's more of sovereignty. It's more of our identity being wiped away. More importantly, it is about the fact that we are not able to organize. Because if you are not educated enough to know that some of these things that are leaving your country should actually stay to benefit your country, that means you can't organize to demand that things are given to you. You can't organize to demand accountability. You don't have the journalists who will blow up the issue for the world to hear. You don't have the lawyers who will litigate it in court to get what you demand. You don't even have politicians who know what is right to do for the country because they don't really have a very African, a very local education. It's more external. It still has that imperial influence on it. So to wrap up, I mean, the children, again, there's so much statistics out there to say that about 28 million of children and youth in Africa are not in the classrooms today. They are uneducated. So the children that are not in school in Eastern Congo or in South Sudan today are citizens who will or will not be able to work in 20 years because they don't have the education. So still that cycle is going to go on where we have Africans who are not educated to take up some of these jobs that are needed to keep the country going. it will not be measured. The fact that they are not getting educations will not be measured by reduced GDPs or the fact that it's a poor country. What is going to happen is that there will be continual vulnerability in these communities because it will be easier to recruit an uneducated person into militia. It will be easier to get some of these people to do things that an educated person would never do. And so it will consistently keep these African countries and the continent as a whole, by extension, instill this cycle of poverty, uneducatedness, vulnerability to some of these conflicts that we have. And so just to wrap things up, I like that the panel has different focuses because the question that I raised, who benefits, really cannot be answered by education alone. Climate, food security, all of these things will come together to help us understand the impact of imperialism on our continent and how it still shows in issues that we have today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. And good luck on the presentation.
Thank you, I need it.
Here a little, because we've emphasized several times today the fact that the impact of imperialism historically and contemporary manifestation is just not on the African continent. The impacts are not even though they're happening in Africa, the impacts are not restricted to Africa. And indeed, they're right here in our own local community. And we're very fortunate to have a presenter who has worked with our large refugee population, many of which, not all, but many of which who come from the continent of Africa. We've had, I know we've given accolades to people already, the participants this morning, but I want to say that two of our presenters who are here today are here because of the students who actively participated in the planning of ours. And Aisha, I don't see Aisha here. She's sick? Oh, sorry. But Aisha was the one that suggested our next speaker, and so hats off to her. And so please pass along our thanks for this, because the student voices were have been very important. Okay, I just met her this morning, but Khadija Moiz is an alumni of the University of Michigan. She's the executive director of the Muslim Foster Care Association. She will talk about the direct services, community impact, and lived experiences of unaccompanied refugee minors who face challenges in obtaining a support system for mental health. So please join me in welcoming Khadija. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a little overwhelmed by all the amazing personalities in this room. So I hope I can kind of meet everyone's expectations. But my name is Khadija, and I serve as the executive director of the Muslim Foster Care Association, which was founded in 2016. And it was formed to support the Muslim foster youth and families in Michigan. In 2021, the Muslim Foster Care Association really came into this scene in Michigan with unaccompanied refugee minors. At the time, there were a lot of youth that had come from Afghanistan, and they all came as unaccompanied refugee minors, and the system was not set up in Michigan to support these youth. Now, no one on our team happened to be, how can I go through the slides? Do I go through them, or do you just click through? I'm clicking through.
That or the keyboard, whichever works. Yeah.
Okay, we can do this. Okay. So at the time, we really didn't have staff that were Afghan, but we had that shared lived, the shared experience of culture and religion. And so fast forward a couple of years, and now the majority of our youth are from African countries. And they're here, and it's crazy. I feel like your presentation literally leads right into mine, because the youth that you're talking about, they're here now, right? Most of them are from the African countries where they've been displaced due to war, due to poverty, due to food crisis, right? And they're here. A lot of them are here in Michigan. There's about 155 of them that we serve in the state of Michigan. There's many here in Lansing, they're in Grand Rapids, they're in Jackson, Kalamazoo, wherever you find agencies such as Bethany Christian Services and Emeritus, who deal with their refugee foster youth. Of those 155 youth, we've got Guinean, we've got from Sudan, we've got from Senegal, Mali, Somalia, and Ivory Coast. So that's the majority of our population. And what we're finding is that their needs are not being met. And their needs are not being met because they're really not understood as a population. And so we come in with things like direct services, something as simple as making sure they have access to halal meat, which is something that they find important. And so, you know, that's one of their needs. Foster family recruitment. A lot of them, you know, they end up in residential homes. They don't want to be in residential homes. They want to be in a home with a family, but that understands their culture, that understands their needs. So where we come in is we support the staff in the agencies. We support foster families. We do recruitment. We launched recently a mentorship program, which I'll talk about. And everything is just kind of grounded in the lived experience of the youth that we are currently serving today. So these youth that are coming, we've already talked about their profound disruptions, right? Loss of family, displacement, interrupted schooling, long periods of uncertainty, and their needs are real, and they're often unmet by the systems because they lack that cultural or religious context. So these youth, they're exactly what they're URM is, unaccompanied refugee minors. So these are all minors that are coming into the country unaccompanied. And so they're placed in foster care or group care, often with no one that really shares their language, their faith, or their cultural background. They've got many of them come from years of disrupted learning, interrupted education. So things like English language learning, academic remediation, vocational skills, those are all really critical needs. For them, their cultural and religious identity is a huge part of who they are. And so that becomes a central anchor. And so access to community, to people, to food, and culturally understanding caregivers really matters to them deeply. And then again, the last thing that's most crucial is their mental health trauma that they're facing. So whether it's uncertainty about their legal status, whether it's isolation due to being in communities that are very rural and where there's people that don't look like them or that don't understand them. So all of those have really led to, and the trauma that they come with has all led to a lot of significant health challenges. And again, that culturally responsive care still remains limited. So I know we talked a little bit about halal meat. Again, food scarcity, that was mentioned earlier, but just something as simple as, where am I getting my food, right? What kind of food am I getting? For a lot of our youth, especially those from African backgrounds, their dietary practice is central to their identity. Again, something that we can overlook, but for them, access to that food, it's not a preference, it's a dignity issue, right? So we've decided to meet these demands is we've partnered with local butchers, halal butchers, and we distribute the meat monthly to the foster families and the youth. We've got distribution partners on the west side of the state and the southeast side of the state. And now, originally, we launched this in 2021 in response to the Afghan youth. And then we relaunched it again in 2025 due to the growing demand from the youth themselves. And again, this helps support the foster families in a time when obviously we see that due to inflation, cost of meat is rising, cost of food is rising. It helps subsidize that cost for them. It reduces that burden. And also it helps them, the youth, be able to maintain their cultural and religious practices. One of the most impactful things that we can do for Muslim URM youth is to place them with families that reflect their faith and culture. So one of our targets is to recruit Muslim families or families that match the child's cultural background. So we engage with Islamic centers, we engage with community organizations, we engage with mosques to reach these prospective Muslim foster parents. We tailor our recruitment materials and conversations and design them with Islamic values in mind, but emphasizing the concept of fostering and community care for vulnerable children. We have community collaborations with the regional immigrant and refugee collaboratives, the foster adoptive kinship councils, faith communities on foster care to expand our outreach statewide. And again, we don't stop at placement. our goal is to stay engaged, to connect these families with resources and training as they navigate the system. Training cultural competency workshops are a huge part of our work too. So we work to train and equip these foster families, the caseworkers, and system partners to help understand the needs of the Muslim youth, particularly those from the African background. So again, their cultural identity, trauma-informed care. So we bring in experts that we know that deal with trauma in refugee youth. You've got so many amazing local experts right here at MSU through the Survivors Center. We utilize them. We utilize anyone who understands behavior cognitive therapy, right? So we're looking for those that match the background of the youth and really try to support the families that way. And then just understanding the URM process, navigating the system, that's a huge part of the work we do. And advocacy is really big for us. Whoops, sorry. That's the wrong button. Our independent living mentorship program, I think this is where we're really focusing strongly on, because a lot of the youth now are aging out of the system. So I think 93% of our unaccompanied refugee minor youth from Africa are male. Which leaves like 6% of them, 7% to be female. They're between the ages of 16 and 20. So a lot of them are aging out, but they're aging out with not enough resources, with not enough support, not knowing how to navigate society. So we have an independent living mentorship program in partnership with Islamic Relief USA. And this is our 3rd year now. And basically, we try to connect the youth to mentors that reflect their community and try to equip them with those real world needs. Their biggest concerns are, their journeys are all different. Some of them are coming because they want to be independent. They want to live their life to the fullest here, but that maturity level may not be there. They don't have that support that they need. So employment readiness, financial literacy, academic tutoring, community connections, all those things are critical. And I think with the people here that I see in this room, the talent I see, the skills that we have, this is something I think that can be done right here, as Dave was saying, in our communities, to allow these youth to be on these climate, advocacy councils, right? On, food scarcity. So they can advocate for their communities and become better citizens here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you again. Sorry. Okay, we're going to transition again. And again, I want to give a shout out this time to Priscilla. Speaker wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the connection that she's had. And it's also very interesting. I must say, as part of the planning committee, that when we were planning and the focus on sort of the historical articulations of colonialism and imperialism and the contemporary neoliberal articulations on Africa, I didn't think immediately of AI, I must say, but I'm glad that it was brought up because I'm very interested in seeing how, I'm sure, I know it does tie in, but the ways that it does tie in. And so I'll introduce quickly Nick while Hassan gets his PowerPoint book. Nicholas Richard Thomas, our Nick, serves as the Deputy Chief of Staff up to the Mayor of the City of Aurora, Illinois. He is the Midwest Regional Organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace, BAP, and founder of Kapuli, is that correct?
Yep, Kapuli.
A mutual aid organization supporting those impacted by deportation. Nick holds a master's degree in public policy from Aurora University. Black Alliance for Peace is a nationwide network of Black grassroots organizations committed to challenging war, militarization, and the systems of exploitation that affect communities in the United States and globally. Across its work, BAP examines how political, economic, and technological systems shape power, resource use, and inequality. In this symposium, Nick contributes perspectives drawn from a broader engagement with issues of land, infrastructure, and global political economy, including how developments such as data centers and resource extraction intersect with community impacts and international dynamics. Welcome, and thank you very much for driving up all the way from Illinois. We appreciate it.
Peace, peace, peace. First and foremost, I want to commend and thank all the organizers for this event. I suspect I'm going to go over time, so I'm going to get straight into it. So the digital extraction chain, data centers, AI in the war of the global majority. What I want to first make exponentially clear, there are a lot of discussions around AI and emerging technologies in communities, and a lot of it is framed as is an inevitability, and it is not. We do not have to displace millions of workers for the use of AI. That's a choice by the ruling class. We do not have to be utilizing AI for advancements in warfare and technology. That's also a choice. We can be utilizing it to advance, investigation into cures for cancer and medicine. So when I talk about AI, some of it's going to come off negative today, but it's because of our political economy and how it's oriented to utilize emerging technologies, not that it's inherently going to be catastrophic. So I just want to make that clear before I get into it. So I'm going to do a brief outline. So first I'm going to define it because there are different forms of AI. I'm going to talk about the cost of it, quite literally the cost like financially, but also the cost ecologically, the cost to our communities, and the repression it is likely to fuel and inform, and then the global implications. And then I'm going to briefly talk about AFRICOM, which is something that BAC works around a lot. AFRICOM is part of the 11 combatant areas of what the United States calls full spectrum dominance. And AFRICOM is changing some of its strategies and going into the future, and it's going to be informed by AI. So the types of AI. So generative AI, right? The reason why these distinctions are important when we're talking about the massive computing power needed, when we're talking about the data centers, we're talking about the land use, there's different forms of it, right? So generative AI is what most people are familiar with. It's the large language models. It's the different projects like Google Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude, and all these other emerging technologies that help with organizing information, sourcing information, things like that. And then you have predictive and algorithmic AI. Those are a little bit different, and the case studies and uses are engaged in a lot of surveillance, right? So when we're talking about AI being used, it's utilized by military forces, it's utilized by local police forces. What it does is predict crime areas and other credit scoring systems that determine who is eligible for resources and where resources should go in communities. The next one is autonomous systems, right? This AI can execute tasks in physical or digital world with little to no human intervention. So what that means is like LAWs or lethal autonomous weapons, so drones are utilized in this, and there's no human in the loop, right? So before drones were utilized with someone at least on directing it, these will be utilizing technology to identify targets, right? We can see why that would be a problem. And some of these are being exported from the UAE to places like Saddam, right? So that's how the connection comes in with AI. Next is computer vision. The use of this is to train computers to see and interpret visual information from the world. So this is satellite imagery. This is how a lot of surveillance takes place as well, but also facial recognition. So this is used at the border oftentimes. So we're seeing the emergence and the increasing of ICE, but also is being used in places like the DRC to monitor resource-rich regions. Finally, you have quantum enhanced AI. This is essentially quantum computing. It's just really fast computers being able to process information a lot quicker than a standard computer. And how this is being utilized is an example is DARPA and their utility scale quantum computing system that is being used to break global encryption, right? So there's something called graphite that's being used by ICE right now that was developed by Israeli technologies. And what it does is it can quickly break into your phone. So a lot of folks, organizers especially, use Signal. It can break into that, you wouldn't even know, right? So these technologies through quantum computing are getting a lot more advanced, a lot quicker, and are being utilized again. It's not an inevitability. It doesn't have to be used for surveillance and warfare. We're choosing, because of our political economy and its orientation, to drive profit, right? And because of that profit, you need repression to maintain those forms of dominance and that those forms of occupation. Next, the empire of AI extraction colonialism. So there's three pillars I'm gonna go through today. Intellectual property. So this is a mass scraping of data from users and artists in global majority without consent. One thing that I want to bring up is important for folks to think about is something called BIPA, which is the digital body, and in Illinois, it's called the Biometric Information Privacy Act. And what this does is it mandates that companies cannot collect or store biometric data, so fingerprints, facial scans, iris recognition, without explicit written consent. Illinois gets a lot of things wrong. This is one of the things that's like correct. And I bring this up to a lot of organizers to talk about and discuss because AI continues to be utilized for facial recognition to perform the surveillance. That's going to be really important as a defense on the front line of the world of AI uses. Next is physical resources. So the land, the massive energy and fresh water. Fresh water has to be used oftentimes in drinking water for the cooling systems for data centers because it corrodes some of the technology, so it has to be very particular water. So it's going to be directly impacting us. And then finally, the human agency. Communities are not going to have the ability to dictate, determine, and decide the uses of land. The use of land already locally is very, very monetized and captured. More and more with data centers emerging, and we're seeing it across the country, they're selling out their communities for this short-term profit. This is a global heat map of like where the concentration of AI and data centers are being utilized. It's primarily in the global north. But I use this because I was reading an article in preparation for this, and there are arguments being made primarily from a neoliberal position that there needs to be massive investment into the continent so that they can, what they identify as close the digital divide and ensure that Africa is not left outside of the AI and data center race. The issue is they're wanting to develop infrastructure. They're wanting to come in and utilize the resources because it's easier for the supply chain to develop this. It's nefarious, right? These same people are not wanting to go in and support investment in public infrastructure for water for drinking, but they're wanting to do it for data centers. So because of the arable land and the labor and the resources. So we're wanting to pre-warn people that this is going to be an emerging discussion and conversation that the continent not only is being impacted directly, but it's being impacted indirectly, directly through surveillance, warfare, and mineral extraction being utilized for these technologies, deeply interconnected, but that they're going to want to eventually extend AI and data centers to the continent so that they can continually extract this profit through these mechanisms, right? And a study by UC Riverside and Caltech, I want to quote really quickly, talks about the inefficiencies of water and the cooling systems that they utilize for these data centers. And what's projected is that from a year from now, it could require 697 million to 1.4 billion gallons of additional peak water capacity per day. This is equivalent to what New York uses. So it's incredibly important that we raise the resources are going to be used, right? Whether it's water or the electric, what ends up happening is it's going to directly impact working class people here to then go to surveillance and warfare globally. This looks at a little bit of the power demand and the necessity to upkeep the data centers and their unquenchable thirst. So according to McKinsey analysis, the United States is expected to be the fastest growing market for data centers, right? So right now, we're looking at 25 gigawatts of demand in 2024 to more than 90 gigawatts of demand in 2030. This growth is fueled by the continued increase in data compute and connectivity from digitalization and cloud migration, as well as the scaling of new technologies, the most important of which is AI. Now, this is important because a lot of folks in the AI industry are saying, well, we have new cooling systems, we won't take water. If they're not taking water, they're taking electricity. There's no way to fund these things and public infrastructure, so public dollars, your taxes, and the money you pay for utilities are going to go up astronomically. I watched a 2-hour conversation with a press conference with the federal government talking about data centers, and they were telling people that your bill will not go up, you will not feel the impact, that they're going to create jobs. This is all a lie. Your bill isn't going to go up here. You're going to face the direct consequences, and it's going to be fueling the surveillance and the warfare globally and your own surveillance locally, right? Because the technology is being tested in places like Palestine, and then it's exported to ICE, and then it's utilized here, and then it's utilized in the economy in Sudan. So it's deeply interconnected. funding our surveillance, right? So again, your utilities are without a doubt gonna go up, but one example I use is in Minnesota, specifically, there's, we're familiar with BlackRock, the asset manager. Yeah, listen, people, folks. The motive that they're doing now is they're bringing in a lot of investment for AI and data centers. And they're trying to buy the public utility in Minnesota because they know the bill is gonna go up. So not only raising the bill there, they're going to benefit from the bills raising, right? This is a strategy that they're aiming to do across the Midwest, right? As a Midwest regional organizer, and that we are working on an actual extended version of this kind of presentation that talks about what's going to be happening regionally and how this is going to fuel the Imperialist project globally, but also it's going to extract here domestically. So understanding the connections. Briefly, I'm gonna go through some of this quickly because there's a lot and I don't want to go over time. DARPA. They're at the center of the cycle of violence and the so-called green revolution. A lot of Western tech hides the structural requirement for what's needed to maintain, advance, and develop these technologies, right? So the minerals stolen from the Congo are the physical body of the AI system that DARPA then uses to monitor and stabilize the rest of the global South. It's this violent system and matrix, right? We've talked about how it's going to raise bills, how it's also going to surveil, and then the resources to maintain this technology. The resources to develop this technology are coming from the continent and other places within the global South. And the technology of the algorithmic warfare, DARPA is producing that. They're the innovation drive behind a lot of this technological development. So beyond commercial use, when we look at the data infrastructure deeply integrated into U.S. Department of War and intelligence systems. So right now there is a movement and it is no tech for apartheid, and they're doing a lot of work around Google, Microsoft, and other large tech firms. And what's currently happening is there's a $1.2 billion cloud project called Project Nimbus. And it is providing Israel with AI and machine learning tools, facial recognition, sentiment analysis, and object tracking. And reports to integrate these tools are systems like Lavender the Gospel to automate kill lists and target Palestinians in their home. Google's producing this and holding this for them. It's likely to come here next. So I bring this up because it's incredibly important to talk about the technologies that are being tested and utilized in the genocide in Palestine are going to come here and they're being utilized. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later how it's impacting Sudan and the Congo directly as well. I briefly talk about this. I think it's important because it's all connected. We can't really talk about AI and data centers without talking about the climate catastrophe. And you can't really talk about the climate catastrophe without talking about the permanent war agenda. And you can't talk about the permanent war agenda, why it's being waged, and that is for the capitalist mode of production, right? So the US military emits more CO2 than many nations, right? I talked to a lot of folks who are in the climate movement, and if we don't talk about the US imperialist project, really the global north kind of domination, we cannot solve the climate catastrophe. There's no way to do it without also being anti-imperialist and anti-war. So if you want to talk about this more after the panel, I would love to, but for the interest of time, I don't want to go over. Next, to get into these two parts. So how is AI and data centers impacting directly the DRC and Sudan? So when you look at the mineral front, the extraction, data center hardware, and AI chips, there's something called GPU. GPUs are these graphics processing units that overheat. So that's where the cooling comes from with the water. And for these GPUs, they rely heavily on cobalt, potent, and this is all coming from the Congo, right? And the violence to maintain this in this emerging economy is going to be directly tied to the already existing crisis in the Congo, which is only going to exacerbate it further. So outside of equal side and the industrial and the artisanal mining for tech minerals that results in deforestation and toxic pollution of the water sources and the conflicts that to maintain this, we start to understand that to defeat data centers here is solidarity internationally, right? And when we're talking about defeating data centers, again, I'm talking about AI and data centers, not as an inevitability to be used how they're being utilized now, not to be built how they're being built now. In fact, where I'm from, we passed the strongest data center regulations in the country. And it maintains that there has to be water tests, sound tests, other pollutions, and it's 100% renewable energy, and the different community agreements based upon what ward they're in. So if folks are organized around data centers, if you're interested in what we passed, let me know. In Sudan, the geopolitical situation and destabilization is interesting because they are getting weapons from the UAE, and a lot of the weapons are exchanged for their gold and access to the gold rather. But a lot of the warfare there have started on the ground. They're introducing more emerging technologies such as drone warfare that we talked about before that are going to be backed, powered, and informed by our artificial intelligence and the different forms of AI that we talked about. So it's going to exacerbate the instability and is often sold to weaken national sovereignty, making it easier for multinational corporations to secure supply chains through lawfare or brute force. And this weaponized scarcity, while data centers in the north consume billions of gallons of water. Here, regions like Sudan face climate, fuel, water, and food insecurity exacerbated by the imperialist intervention as well. So briefly, when we talk about the human cost of the so-called green AI revolution, folks have already talked about the Congo and its circumstances in really great detail. But what I want to add to this and add to the conversation about this emerging economy of AI and data centers is that when folks are forced into these mines to with their bare hands to get the toxic collapsing pits and to feed this global supply chain that is human life, right? And the data centers claim sustainability and green energy, but the cobalt is an essential component for the lithium-ion battery that provide backup power for these facilities. So when a lot of these data centers come in, they say, this is how we're going to be doing it. It's green, don't worry. That's why where we're from, we made sure that there were particular agreements to avoid this, but there's a lot of sleight of hand, misconception, because even if they were to use 100% renewable energy without community agreements, it still impacts the global economy and global humanity worldwide. Next, the first generative AI civil war. So both the RSF and SAS have used generative AI to create leaked audio recordings. Recently, there was a U.S. ambassador, and they manipulated his voice to sway local opinion, and it creates deep confusion. So outside of just the drone warfare, AI is being used in other nefarious ways for new forms of warfare on different fronts, right? So this AI clone voice of the U.S. ambassador was used to manipulate local public opinion and political realities to fuel violence, to specifically target the American interests in the region. And the recording, the AI-generated voice, outlined a plan to increase secularism with Sudan, while the exact origin of the clip remains unknown. It was likely created by either Western-backed forces to undermine influence in the region. So I bring that up because AI is being used in other creative ways outside of just drones, outside of the surveillance. It's being used in many ways to sway public opinion and create propaganda for these groups. So there's layers, and I see it as a matrix of how locally we are seeing the funding from public dollars. Your bills are rising, there is surveillance, and then when you tie it into the international question of where resources are being extracted from and where warfare is being waged on and for the need of resources, land and labor, we want to tie that in and talk about the project itself. So finally, these are references and resources. And the last thing I really want to say is that, again, none of this is inevitable. And that if you want to challenge data centers and AI locally, it's important to understand the international kind of dynamics. And if we're talking about AI and data centers, we have to talk about climate change. Let's talk about food sources and the different migration patterns. And that we identify these crises as not individual, but collective. It's a crisis of imperialism. Migration doesn't just happen, right? It's a phenomenon that is created and manufactured through the destabilization of people's economies, the undermining of their sovereignty, and it leads to the crises that they claim here that they've invented, right? And then they abuse these people. So I'm looking forward to the panel, looking forward to questions, but that's it. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Nick. And we look forward to after lunch having the opportunity to interact. We're going to quickly go on to the last two before we break for lunch. And as I said, because of the time delay that we've had, and because the size of the audience, what we're going to do after lunch is that we're going to have a breakout. We're going to start the group breakout because we didn't have the opportunity to interact with Professor Ntalaja. We're going to do that. And then I think because Nick has come all the way from Chicago, we're going to give people a chance jointly to respond and to interact as a group to your presentation. And then we'll go on then to the others as well. But I think that's, given the realities that we're in right now, that's probably the best that we can do. Okay, we want to move on to the second to last of our panel presentations. And this has to do with food security and the relationship between, which is very, very real, as I'm sure you can imagine, as you know, and conflict both past and present in Africa. Let me get my glasses on so I don't stumble over what I read. Dr. Kwame Yeboah is somebody that I have had the privilege of knowing for quite some time here. I think since you came as a graduate student so many years ago. Is a scholar originally from Ghana, is director of MSU's Tanzania Partnership Program within the Partnership for Sustainable Community Development. He's also affiliated as a fixed-term assistant professor in international development in the Department of Agriculture, Food, and Resource Economics, and a member of the Food Security Group. His expertise is in multiple areas of social policy, including agriculture and food system transformation, natural resource management, and youth livelihood issues in Africa. For the past decade, he's provided critical analysis to inform a range of social policies both in the U.S. and in Africa. Most recently, he served as the lead author for the 2018 Global Food Security Report commissioned by the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. Thanks very much, Kwame. We look forward to your 10-minute presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, John, for that introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here and thank the organizers for inviting me to speak on this quite important topic, especially as we're talking about lunch afterwards. So, I'll particularly be mindful that I'm standing between you and your lunch. So I was pleased to hear from our speaker today, sharing some of the historical perspective in terms of how imperialism has shaped both past and even the present state that we find ourselves in. So I wanted to also speak a little bit about it from a food security standpoint. Navigating slides. But I got it. So given that I have very short time, I just want to go straight to two key points that I want to emphasize today. And the first one is that when we think about imperialism, the imperialism created and it also entrenched an economic system that was designed to disadvantage Africa's development. And that economic system still persists today. And you can think of it from the fact that the economic system was designed for two main things. One, it was meant to make the continent the producer of cheap raw materials to support the industrial economy. And then the second aspect of it is to be a consumer of the product that is coming from the West. And this kind of economic system also shaped the agri-food systems in various ways that continue to influence food security of today. And I'm going to be sharing just a little bit about the way that these dimensions, the way that these systems have informed food security or the situation that we find in Africa today. So typically when we talk about food security, we are looking at 4 main dimensions of food security. So the first one is whether the food is available, is the physical presence of that food. So that is shaped by the amount of food that is produced either locally or whether it's coming from outside in form of import or even food aids or even stock levels that we have in the country. But then when food is available, it does not mean that it's accessible to everyone. So there is also an access issue, which can be economic access, or it can also be physical access, that people may not have access to that particular food. And then there is the aspect of utilization. And utilization, we are thinking about the nutrition, the nutritional content, and then how safe the food is for the persons that are going to be consuming. And then lastly, we are looking at how reliable, the stability, how reliable over time across all those 3 elements. So are there seasonal shocks? Are there times that they have all 3 available and times where they do not have all those available? And we see that there are a lot of policies that were put in place during colonial time to achieve those 2 main goals that have influenced things as they are today. So when we look at food availability, one of the primary focus of colonial policies had been export-oriented. And export-oriented focus meant that we needed to produce products that will be in demand by the industrial economy, not products that the local individuals will be able to eat. So there was a lot of emphasis. So for example, a number of African economies ended up producing cocoa, coffee, tea. Much of it is not likely consumed by the local, and prime lands were allocated to these in the form of plantations. And then you have situations where individuals were displaced from those prime lands in order to make way for these cultivation or for the cultivation of these cash crops. And then much of agricultural incentives and the research and development were also targeted at these cash crops. So when Laura was speaking, he talked about how even millet seems to be low yielding, right? And it was whilst products like maize, soybean are seen to be high yielding. It was also because much of the research was done to support maize and others because the millet were consumed locally. So millet, bambara beans, and the rest were all consumed locally and were not in demand in Europe. So much of research did not go into those food products. And as a result of that, we saw that because the emphasis was on producing cash crop, the amount of food that needed to be produced for individuals to eat or what the local people would eat went down, which means food production was lower in those countries. And that led to now a reliance on food imports. So much of those African countries then relied on importing food, primarily wheat, the rice, and the maize from outside. So currently we have Africa's import bill now stands about $65 billion a year to import food from outside. And just between 2001 and 2014, this number actually increased about 13 folds. And then the issue of food access. So to create dependency on just the metropoles or make the economy external, there are a lot of structural barriers that were put in place that limited regional trade. So the colonies did not interact. The colonies interacted directly with their colonial powers, which means that whatever roads that were being constructed were constructed from an area where there's resources to the ports. And then those resources can then be headed back to Europe or where the colonial powers were. So there was not much road construction within that will foster an integration among the locals, right? And then the introduction of new currency in post-colonial times, as well as even the languages that came, meant that there was additional barrier of interaction, which also limited the amount of access of food that individuals will be able to have. And then just around, even in the post-independent stage, that like in the 1962, when the European Union was discussing ways to be able to achieve food sovereignty. And the discussion was put in place measures that allow for more subsidies to support farmers, revitalize rural areas. Debt burdens that African government faced resulted in a structural adjustment program for the IMF and the World Banks, which de-emphasized investment in social protection programs. So then farmers were faced to compete with highly subsidized food imports coming from Europe and coming from outside, which made it less profitable for people to even to grow their own food. So now we have a situation where most individuals did not see it vital, did not see it relevant to be able to produce their own food, which further decreased the kind of agriculture that individuals were going to engage in. And the resultant aspect of it is that because of these structural barriers, when you look at intra-regional trade, Africa does not trade among itself. Africa trades with everyone else, but within Africa, intra-regional trade is less than 15% of total trade. This compares to about 70% in Europe. So there's not much of an integration among Africa. And even as we were talking about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the road networks that will link the transportation of product from one area to another is quite limited. And all of that infrastructure will need to be developed in order to make that successful. And then because of the reliance on imports, most individuals have to face higher prices. So Africans end up spending a higher share of their income on food. Some countries, you're talking about 40% of their income is spent on food, compared to the US, where we spend about 10 to 11% of our income on food. And then in the aspect of the food utilization, which is in relation to nutrition, there was also much emphasis on monocropping. And that monocropping meant that some of those diverse indigenous diets, some of those that are very nutrient rich. So for example, Bambara beans was known to be more nutritious and very much drought tolerant than soybean. But that was never promoted, and because it was deemed to be a local food. So so much of nutrition promoted soybean over the Bambara beans. And when climate change and others started happening, it meant that the locals have lost that knowledge of cultivating these that will allow them to be able to become resistant to whatever shocks and also food insecurities that they were facing. And then in recent times, we've also seen a lot more promotion of Western products. So there's a diet that is very shifting. If you go, so for example, if you go to much of supermarkets in Africa, what you now see is a lot of these imported sugary foods, which is now have left this diet shifting, right? So we have diets that are shifting from the traditionally nutrient-dense food, which was the legumes and the wheat, to now being, it's more convenient, it's nutrient poor, but it's ultra-processed products. And the effect of it is that we are seeing across the continent this double burden of nutrition, where undernutrition or malnutrition now lies alongside with overnutrition. So the statistics indicate that now about 30% of children who are under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa are stunted. Stunting affects their ability to be able to learn, and which eventually affects their ability to be to be economically active in the future. At the same time, we're also seeing almost about 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 of adults are determined to be obese. And this number has actually doubled just between 2016 and 2024. And then in terms of food stability, with all these historical disregard for investment in indigenous local language, local knowledge systems, as well as some of these resilient local farming systems, and Africans having lost some of those, we are now seeing a whole lot of vulnerability to global shocks. So whatever is coming, because everything is coming from outside, when there's inflation outside, we import that inflation also into the country. And a typical example is when we just had the Ukrainian war. Many African countries import fertilizer as a key input from Russia and Ukraine. More than half African countries import fertilizer from that area. So when there was conflict there, what it means is those inputs were no longer available, and it was happening just around a time where there was planting season. And that impacted agricultural productivity, which means the amount of food that could be produced locally was impacted. In the same way, we also have some countries, and a number of them, importing about 30 or 50% of their wheat supply coming from this region also. So now that also led to high prices. So increasingly, the continent is becoming more and more vulnerable because they have been very much integrated into the global economy. So as I conclude here, the main point has been that imperialism in Africa, it transformed these agri-food systems from one that was locally controlled, one that was a little bit more diverse and resilient, to one that is more externally oriented. It became very unequal, and then also became vulnerable to all these kinds of disruptions. And returning back or thinking about ways to be able to enhance productivity, investment, making technology available, enhancing, supporting the African, the majority of them smallholder farmers, majority of them who produce at least about 80% of the food that is consumed locally, is going to be an important step towards that building that economic transformation that would allow Africans to actively participate in this. And I do a lot of work around youth work. And then when you look at the demographics that we currently have, we know that at least 1 in 4 by 2030, 1 in 4 of the world youth is going to be living on the continent of Africa. What it means is that anyone who is trying to develop any kind of a market or any technology, whatever thing that you are developing today, your market, Africa is going to be an important aspect of that market. So but it will never be a market unless economic opportunities expand in these particular areas. And we can make that investment today to make that market there. So I often put it this way, that an investment to bring about that economic transformation, which the food part is going to be an important part, is definitely going to be an investment in our own future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwame. Okay, we're going to, seeing the time, we're going to move quickly. And I apologize for leaving our most senior presenter to last. And when we're thinking about the impact long-term of colonialism and imperialism, and then also the contemporary manifestations of imperialism, one of the areas are both, in addition to the governments, are pharmaceuticals. And our
David Wiley, who has already been introduced, who has too many accolades to repeat here, but so I won't do that. He has been long committed to many aspects of addressing inequality in the continent of Africa, and certainly one of his more recent passions, having in post-COVID, looking at the impact of our policies and the policies of our pharmaceuticals on what he calls vaccine apartheid. So he's going to give a brief overview of this at this time.
Well, that may be quick and short, if that's at all possible. I'm here to ask you to take action today to get on board to a movement to stop vaccine apartheid in Africa and the global South. So you will actually find a petition to sign. I think it's in the lunchroom there, and where you can check the box to keep me informed as you get on more of this urgent train. Vaccines are wonderful, in spite of my horrible memories as a kid going down to the gym in elementary school and lining up to get our typhoid, diphtheria, and measles shots, and getting thanks to Dr. Salt when at last we could get polio vaccination with a sugar cube. So anyway, we don't remember because we were not around when our grandparents and great-grandparents were living during the time of World War I, when the Spanish flu hit the world, wiped out 50 million people around the world. And indeed, even in the United States, there were 675,000 people died of the Spanish flu because medical science was trying to find a vaccine or a cure, and they failed. It wasn't until 1942 that the flu virus was actually figured out. And so we have the vaccines that in the case of COVID, we have one other imperial oppression of Africa. And that oppression was that because of capitalism of American pharmaceuticals, there was little vaccine given to Africa. In fact, as the World Health Organization has said, 5 billion people 5 billion doses of the vaccine for COVID-19 were administered. But those in the poorer nations and most of Africa received less than 2% of those. About 1 in 7 Africans got their first shot, and still already 3.5 billion people around the world have not gotten their COVID vaccines. That's why we call it vaccine apartheid, because it's largely based, you didn't get a vaccine because of the poverty of your country, the greed of the pharmaceutical industries, and that you were Black in those countries, which Trump and others were derogating. So the answer is, what do we do about this? We try to get it so the vaccines for the next pandemic, and there will be one, are available. We already had the hint of one when in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we had an outbreak of what we call mpox now. It was for a brief time called monkeypox. Monkeypox is treated with the same vaccine that smallpox is. The United States has about 4 treatments of smallpox locked up in the freezers for every single American that exists. But when Africa came and said, will you release your smallpox vaccinations to stop this potential pandemic, we said no, backed away from it. And so there are 2 ways that Africa has been subjected to imperialism in this world of vaccines and diseases. The first one is this one, the denial of the vaccines for COVID. We thought we had a breakthrough. May 4th, 2021, Joe Biden announced that the United States was going to give permission to the world to have temporary access to the patent rights in order to produce their own vaccines. That was great news because there are 132 companies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in the poor countries there, that can do vaccines. So we all were celebrating, you know, that Biden had done the right thing. But guess what? Big Pharma said, no way, our profits are not going to do that. So Big Pharma, how many lobbyists in Washington? 1,832 registered lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industries, more than twice that of the military industrial complex lobbyists that were there, with a budget of about $500 million a year to seek to make sure that the pharmaceutical rights to profits are not interfered with. So they said no, and the World Trade Organization then, with the backing of Germany and the UK pharmaceutical industries, with the US backed away. These poor companies, you know, said in a statement, we cannot give away the patent rights because that will decrease American employment, and we mustn't do that. It will take away money that we need to develop new boosters and so on, which we all were getting, right? Like, in fact, many of us got 3 boosters when those 1 in 7 Africa never even had their first shot in that. And so even though, and this is the shocking thing, I think, that in developing the COVID-19 vaccines, what percentage did the pharmaceutical companies put into that development? Less than 5%. There are different estimates, but certainly more than 90% of the development of the vaccine that saved us all from that pandemic came from public tax dollars. And with the public tax dollars, we had the right, President Biden thought, on May the 4th in 2021 and say, yes, US is on board. We'll give up our patent rights and so on. But immediately with the lobbying and the naysaying from the pharmaceutical industries, with their millionaire CEOs, one right here in Michigan at Pfizer down at Kalamazoo. Annual salaries of Pfizer and Moderna CEOs, more than 20 million a year salary. That's plus the stock options from which the money really comes. So what can be done about this when Big Pharma says no? We think it's a movement to develop in the United States a movement of outrage at this apartheid, that in the name of profits, that the rest of the world is being denied access to manufacture their own vaccines, which of course is what the American manufacturers do not want to happen. They want to make sure that the profits line stays here. The second wave of imperialism, well, sorry, I might interject one more thing. Simply to say, it doesn't have to be this way. We have a wonderful case here on campus where one of our veterinary professors, Professor Charles McKenzie, stepped in when he found lots of elephantiasis in Tanzania to go to the Merck company and said to Merck, we need your ivermectin. Any of you buying ivermectin, by the way? You know, President Trump wanted us all to take ivermectin to stave off the COVID-19. In fact, many of us have it in our homes because it's the favored medicine for heartworm in dogs, whether it's called Mectizan or ivermectin. But Merck was asked, with your profits on heartworm medicines for dogs, will you give some to help Africa do that? Merck said yes. And more than 5 billion doses of treatment to stop elephantiasis and river blindness have been given in Africa 13 countries are on the verge of wiping out the disease, and the aim is by 2030, in order to actually completely wipe out the disease across much of Africa, some places in Latin America, and Yemen, which also has it as well. So the Merck story is just a miracle, and there are actually millions of people have been saved from these two terrible diseases spread by the mosquitoes. If the capitalist interests weren't enough to punish Africa for being a place that we don't respect, along comes Mr. Trump, who decides to cut U.S. aid money for Africa and for African health. And so that immediately hit the PEPFAR program, which some of you may know. It provides retrovirals to treat HIV in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Biden administration and its Congress had passed a bill buying a bunch of these retrovirals and had them shipped to Africa. They were on the shelves in the clinics and hospitals and pharmacies for HIV treatment in much of Africa. Mr. Trump, apparently with the advice of Mr. Musk, denied the right to disseminate these free medicines that were then allowed to expire, because as a result of that, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of HIV babies being born now whose mothers were denied the HIV that actually had been sent by the US government to treat them. The other cuts of US aid have wiped out health work, for instance, donations for dealing with bed nets and treatments of malaria. It's estimated that since Trump's cuts of US aid, that there are at least 10 million new cases of malaria in Africa. There are all sorts of people across Africa that are now not receiving basic health care that US aid had helped to support. And as in what Mr. Trump called the America First health policy for Africa, country by country has been presented with an MOU that says, sign on here, promise us access to your minerals, and in some cases, exclusive access. Promise us that you will send us specimens of all your diseased folks and give us access to all of your health data for 25 years. And we'll come back and give you what it turns out to be about half the amount of money that they were receiving before 2025. So another imperialist attack on Africa. What can we do? Be outraged that we are a driver of this second attack, and indeed the first attack, because of the greed of our pharmaceutical companies, and to say no more. And so that's why about 20 organizations on International Health Day, April 7th, announced this campaign just now beginning. So you have a chance to be one of the first audiences to know about this and to get a chance to sign on. Join us, be outraged, and we will be feeding various action items to especially expose the pharmaceutical companies and their stopping of the providing of patent rights to the producers in Africa and so on. So let me leave it at there. You'll find the statement that we released on April 7th to start this campaign, and the petition to sign in the lunchroom as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Okay, so we are running well behind, but it's been a good morning. So we're going to take a break now. We'll